thanks very much for the brief intro, and we'll just do a very quick round of introductions of both the methods group as well as the attendees today before we get into our first question. So as Chris indicated, I'm Holger Schönmann. I work at McMaster University. I'm co-convener of the Grading Methods Group. And the second person here today is Gordon Guyatt, the other co-convener of the Methods Group, distinguished professor at McMaster University. And the third presenter or participant, and I just emphasize the word participant because we want this to be a interactive session, is Romina Brignadello-Peterson, who is an assistant professor also in the Department of Health Evidence and Impact, and last but not least, Nancy Santeso, I'm also an assistant professor in the department. I'm probably known to many of you for the workshops that we are doing at the Cochrane colloquia, etc., on summary of findings tables and rating the certainty of evidence. And summary of findings tables is a very good buzzword for us. That's essentially or very much part of our mandate, the actual development of summary of findings tables. I'm just trying to share my screen here. Let me just see if that works. Does it work? Chris, I'm going to ask you.
I can't see it at the moment, Holger. Let me send a message for you to make you presenter.
That would be great in case that becomes necessary. Anyways, just for introductory purposes, that's fantastic. If we can just do this. So summary of findings tables are an essential backbone of Cochrane systematic reviews, as you know, mandatory for intervention reviews, and they summarize the key findings of a systematic review by listing the healthcare question using the PICO format here, where the outcomes are listed in rows, providing information about what studies were found, how many people participated, the certainty rating, relative and absolute estimates of the effect.
Holger, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're not actually seeing your screen. Is there a message that's kind of tucked behind another window, perhaps?
That's very possible, and I will try to make sure that I find that particular message that may be tucked behind another screen, which is very, very possible. But while I'm doing this, I'll just send it over to Gordon to introduce himself, and Romina and Nancy, so that everybody knows who is online.
Hi, Gordon Guyatt. As Holger said, I work at McMaster University and am a co-convener of the DIST Methods Group, and with Holger, co-chair of the GRADE Working Group.
And Romina?
Hello, everyone. I'm Romina. I'm also from McMaster. I'm currently the lead of the GRADE Network Meta-Analysis Project Group. I'm happy to be here and have this session with all of you.
And hi, I'm Nancy Santeso. I'm, as we said, at McMaster University and also Deputy Director of Cochrane Canada.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for the intro. And now you should be seeing my screen. So the summary of findings tables are very much at the heart of our activity. And just the very brief background, this group started more than 2 decades ago as the Applicability and Recommendations Methods Group. It became very clear that there is nearly complete overlap with what with the work that was done by the GRADE Working Group, that will get to in just a second by addressing our very first question. And that very first question, a repetition, but still it was felt to be worthwhile to be addressed, is how do I get involved with the Cochrane GRADEing Methods Group? And the brief answer is, because of what I just said, the brief answer is to get involved with the GRADE Working Group. There is nearly complete overlap in the membership, and most of the methods development happens within the grade working group. And the grade working group obviously is a little bit broader than what the Cochrane GRADEing Methods Group actually focuses on, which is more systematic review focused, in that the grade working group also deals with issues around how to take that information and support decision making by various types of decision makers, including in particular health guideline groups. Nevertheless, from the name, and that's why I mentioned it, recommendations, which was part of our earlier name, you can tell that the information that, or what we're doing in the grade working group was felt to be relevant for systematic reviews. Key products for us are listed on this particular side, which the training team put wonderfully together. Key products related to the grade working group that was also circulated to do. And then with regards to membership, again, you can get in touch with us. Here's our on the grade working group website, and I ask again Chris and Ella to put this again in the chat that is being done. Here you can get in touch with us in order to sign up for membership. That translates back to the grading methods group. So that's the first point perhaps to make. In relation to that, the second question is whether or not you need to be an expert methodologist to get involved. And I just reiterate the following point. The grade working group is completely open to any member. And as you will hear, I hope, from some of our other presenters or participants, whatever level you start joining at can be very rewarding. Gordon mentioned a bit earlier, it's both about education and actual and active contribution. All of that is possible. We hold meetings twice a year, fairly large meetings, and there are many working and project groups that people can get involved with. So let me to maybe add to that question, I'll ask one of my co-presenters if they want to chime in on that, and then we go to some of the additional questions that were actually raised about grade, in particular focusing on methods. Not sure if Gordon, Romina, or Nancy want to add to that.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, no additions to that. So let me start with the first question. It's actually just think back to the summary of findings table. I have one summary of findings table here. Questions primarily relate to that, but we have a great question that deals with when there are 0 events, and I will post this question in the chat for us, and it has to do with when there are 0 events in both the intervention and the control group, and if under those circumstances grading should still take place. Any of my co-participants wants to take this on?
Maybe I can start the discussion by saying, in my opinion, grading should always take place. And I don't know if someone else wants to add about ideas on how, but the short answer is yes.
So the particular question, Romina, was you have maybe 1 or more trials. At any rate, there's 0 out of 50 events in the intervention group, in the control group, and 0 out of 50 events in the intervention group. In particular for adverse events, how would we address it? And you rightly said grading should always take place. It obviously offers that there's going to be problems with imprecision based on that. But if the outcome was critical, you would continue with the grade assessment and possibly just indicate that there is imprecision. Under those circumstances, it's very unlikely that the absolute estimates of effect are going to be very helpful, because there's only 100 participants in the studies, And under those circumstances, that will not help you with addressing imprecision, which is difficult anyways. Under those circumstances, the difference in the absolute risk would be 0 as well. But it doesn't really help you under those circumstances. So yes.
Sorry, I was just going to interrupt. Is it about, I'm just reading the question, and I just wondered is it about when there's just one study that's 0 out of 50 and 0 out of 50, and then you have a total meta-analysis? I know, typically it ends up just being not estimable in the RevMan, and then sometimes we think, now when I'm actually assessing my evidence, here's this study that's really not contributing, and although it could increase the number of people in the analysis, and how would I handle that? That might be another sort of follow-up question to if your total meta-analysis had 0 and 0 events.
Well, I think this question, so there's 2 points. This question relates, as I understand it, to the results of the systematic review. In other words, if you had a row like this, 0 events in 100 participants, and under those circumstances, yes, you would still rate the certainty very likely to be very low certainty if you indeed had these results. With regards to a single study contributing 0 events in a meta-analysis, there's way to, under those circumstances, you probably don't include that particular study, difficult to do. Again, you could include a study like this potentially in an absolute risk meta-analysis, but again, it wouldn't resolve the problem of imprecision. Statistically, from a meta-analytical standpoint, when both arms, if it was about a meta-analysis, and this referring to a single study, when both arms have 0 events, you cannot do the continuity correction appropriately. So that would not be included. But the rating, as Romina said, should always take place.
Can I add, Holger?
Sure, yeah.
First of all, there is controversy. There is papers that say that there's ways to include the 0-0. The position in the RevMan clearly is you don't include. However, it really depends on the denominator. Let's say your denominator you had 0 of 200 and 0 of 200. Under those circumstances, you know that the absolute difference between the groups has to be very small. So even 0.50, 0.50, you could think, well, what if you put 1 of 50 and 1 of 50? You've got, under those circumstances, 2% in both groups, and the absolute is likely to be small. So as if you think in terms of absolutes, as your denominator rises, it's more and more likely that if there is a difference between the groups, the difference is going to be very small.
Yes, and we often have these scenarios when there are few trials, in particular if the duration of follow-up is short. Many venous thromboembolism trials are like this, 40 participants in each group, no events. That doesn't mean that there is no difference, and imprecision expresses this. Nancy, and then we can go to the next question, which is actually very related. Nancy,
sure, I was going to say, we always get asked about these rare events and how, we have some rules of thumb that are 300 events that you need to have to be precise. And so then people always ask, well, what if, in my outcome, we will never have that many events. And so then people ask, okay, so how do we now rate imprecision? So just to mention that might be helpful for people.
Great, yes. And the second question I posted in the chat related to this, again, if one of you wants to take this on, where you have an effect estimate with wide 95% confidence intervals spanning possible benefit and possible harm, but the data come from thousands of participants from several studies, would you generally still expect to see a downgrade for imprecision? Very happy for somebody else to take that as a first shot, and then I can support this with a graph. Romina?
Well, I think that maybe to start, the one point to always reiterate is that whenever we're assessing imprecision, we're focusing on absolute estimates of effect. So in a situation in which we have thousands and thousands of participants, but very, very few events, maybe our relative estimates of effects will have confidence intervals that are wide. But when we actually look at those in absolute terms, the confidence intervals are not as wide and do not cross as many thresholds. So it would be less likely that in a situation like that, we would rate down for imprecision. So that would be a consideration. I know Gordon wanted to say something, so maybe he can continue.
Yeah.
No, Holger is going to illustrate beautifully. I can already see with what's on the screen.
Yeah, I think this is addressing the issue. So let's just assume that your meta-analysis in the treatment group has 10,000 individuals. The placebo group, comparison group, has 10,000 individuals, but you have very, very few events, say 1 and 2, for various reasons. While the confidence interval around the relative estimate of the effect may include both appreciable benefit and harm, if you actually calculate the confidence interval around the risk difference, the absolute effect, you quickly see that this is extremely small with fairly tight confidence intervals. So that's always important to keep in mind. And as Romina said, this is what we are rating our certainty in. Then for decision making, the confidence interval around the absolute risk difference. Okay. Gordon, if you wanted to add to that, otherwise we can go to one of our next questions, and that, in my view at least, feeds in very nicely with what we are just discussing, and that is the question was around what about the confidence intervals, both what about the confidence interval likely crossing the threshold of benefits, possibly also crossing the threshold of harms. How do we make these determinations about the thresholds? And the next question then that is a leftover from our previous setting is who should decide the values for the various thresholds? I'm posting it in the chat then. And the question is, who should decide? So anybody wants to take this on? Gordon or Nancy, do you want to follow up on the conversation that we had earlier about decision thresholds? And then I'll put something in the chat that might be particularly relevant.
Yeah, I think we are always asked this question, and in particular when we say, oh, how, we say, oh, when they're wide and they cross thresholds, or who's going to determine those thresholds? And I think if we're doing a systematic review, we had answered it earlier. Sometimes you actually have research about what is a benefit, what kind of benefit we would want to see in an outcome such as quality of life, and we can look for that research. But I think we know that we don't often have that research, and there does need to be a decision within the systematic review group. So in those cases, we always do hope that we have a broad representative systematic review group, and we just have to make that judgment and be transparent about it, because previously people were making judgments about what was a large effect or a benefit, and not being clear about what kind of thresholds they were choosing.
Great, and just to add to this, so the thresholds that we are particularly interested in particular when we make partially contextualized ratings, are 3 thresholds for that move us from a trivial or no important effect to a small effect, the threshold that moves us from a small to a moderate effect, and the threshold that moves us from a moderate to a large effect. For those of you who listened to Gordon speaking earlier, I put a link to a study where we're trying to determine these thresholds in the chat for those of you who are interested in participating. But this is really what we're talking about, and in a decision-making context where this partially contextualized rating is probably more applicable. You would work with your panels, as Nancy said. Gordon, I don't know if you want to add anything to this. Otherwise, I go to the next question, or Romina, of course.
I was just going to say, maybe Gordon can let us know for like 10 seconds about the MID database that they are working on, which might also be a resource for systematic reviewers.
Right. So Nancy mentioned that there may be evidence available. If your outcome is a patient-reported outcome measure, there has been tremendous amount of work, and work is ongoing where people have got empirical information about what minimally important differences are. In work led by Tahira Devji and Alonso Carrasco, we've created an inventory of all the minimally important differences known to humankind, and are proceeding to get this database up and functional so everybody can have a look. If you're interested in what the MID, you have a patient-reported outcome measure and interested in what the MID is, you could send me an email.
Great. Okay, and then we have an active question in the chat that I'm slightly struggling with, but I will try to see if I interpret it correctly. Otherwise, I will ask Chiara Arienti, who posed this question, to help me with it. And this question relates to overviews of reviews. And the question is, do you suggest to apply grade an overview of systematic reviews that includes both systematic reviews, and I suspect the CSRS stands for Cochrane systematic reviews, but correct me if I'm wrong. Two quick words on that. One is that ideally, when using systematic reviews for decision making, we focus on one systematic review that includes a rating of the certainty of the evidence, and you can obviously use other existing systematic reviews to supplement if, for instance, you detect that studies should have been included but are not included in your base systematic review that you use for decision making. This being said, there is a group, a project group in GRADE that is looking at presenting results of overviews of systematic reviews that is still working in progress. Not sure if anybody else has any additional answers to that. No. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? If not, then I will place a question for Nancy here, which is related to the informative statements. And I'm going to pull this up, Nancy. I'm going to put it in the chat. You have that question too. It's in row number 20. And let me know if you cannot see it. I will pull up the relevant paper and the decision thresholds. Sorry, the narrative statement. So the question is, we greatly welcome the paper on informative statements, but number one, why introduce additional complexity? Not one threshold for clinical relevance, but several thresholds. This could result in several informative statements for one outcome: small effect, moderate, small, moderate, and large effects, each with its own grading. And two, why avoid the term smallest clinically important benefit? The term small important effect could be misused to claim relatively high certainty for effects that are not clinically relevant. So a long question directly relates to this, in part relates to what Gordon spoke about earlier today in the session. Nancy, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think that in the beginning we did sort of start with, way back. We started out with just making a threshold for something that's important or clinically relevant. Can't remember our wording for it. And started using it that way, and we just said something worked or something had a slight effect. And it over time, it turned out that people wanted more than that. They wanted to say whether it was actually a large effect, or it was you know, an important moderate effect, or it was an effect, but it was quite small, and then there was just no effect. So it really did just, we tried it. We tried doing it by just having, you know, sort of one threshold, and it didn't seem to work because people who were doing systematic reviews wanted to communicate the size of that effect. And guideline developers and people using and making decisions, they want to know, is this a really big effect, you know, or is this something small, but you know, might help, but it's small. So that really people wanted that fine tuning. And you know, the more you use it, you actually do realize that that's what you're doing. You are making these large, small, and not really relevant effects. And then I don't know, I'm finding it hard to understand the last.
Maybe as you're looking at this question, just to add to this, Nancy, the other reason for thinking more carefully about the thresholds is that when you make decisions, you never make decisions on the basis of a single outcome. So, for instance, you may have two harmful outcomes that cause some effect, and it may be just a small potential harm, but you have a desired outcome, a desired health benefit that you weigh those harms against. You would want to know whether or not the effects on the benefit are large, in particular in comparison to the smaller harms, and therefore that expression in particular for decision makers is actually quite important. The second part, Nancy, I don't know if you want to, has to do with the clinically important effect. I think the word clinical in the minimal important effect has been dropped a while ago. MID database, you just heard this being said to express that it's really not what the clinician thinks is relevant as one of the reasons. It's about what the actual person who's affected by the outcome thinks. So it's MID. Gordon, do you want to, Nancy, do you want to address that second part of the question, or Gordon, anything to add to that?
Well, just to emphasize what you just said, we think the words we use are important. So long ago, Hoger led us in a paper where we said, where did the clinically and minimally clinically important difference go? It's gone. And the reason is we think we should use words that reflect whose values and preferences we're talking about, which is the patient's. So it's just a minimally important difference, and it's a patient important outcome, not a clinically important outcome.
Great, thank you. And then there's one more question by email, and then there's a few questions coming in through the chat. I'm going to read it if one of my co-presenters wants to address it. So it is, if the objective of a review is to compare treatment A versus treatment B, but where drug A and drug B are add-on therapies alongside a combination of other related drug treatments, and there's no evidence of single drug A versus single drug B alone, is the objective sufficient not to downgrade for indirectness? And I'm looking at participants. Gordon, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, what is going on clinically in the environment of interest? So very often now we have multiple interventions that are given to people. If you look at the cardiovascular area and you've just had a myocardial infarction, anything that gets added on now typically gets added on to 5 other drugs, and that's clinical practice. So something very often considering drug A versus drug B with nothing else going on is actually irrelevant to the real world practice. So you have to look at your situation. Now, if what's happened is there's a baseline that doesn't actually reflect current practice, well, then you have an indirectness issue. And then you have to say, okay, how much, if you did have A and B alone, how much effect, to what extent does other things being as a baseline likely to modify the effect of A versus B? And to the extent that you suspect that the effect of A versus B will be modified, by the addition of other therapy. To the extent you believe that's the case, you're going to rate down for indirectness.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go to a next question that is still somewhat related and this is a question from Jorge again. Thanks very much for being so active. Really, really appreciate it. It relates in part to what we have talked about before I go to a question from Elisa. And the question here is, when an intervention is rated as low quality and has moderate effect size, can we actively recommend it? Does the scenario change when potential harms are extremely unlikely and the majority of competing interventions will likely have low quality as well? Anybody wants to go for that?
Should we first clarify that we shouldn't be making recommendations in systematic reviews?
That sounds good, Nancy. First clarification, yes. That is an important one. So if you look at chapter 14 and 15 in the Cochrane Handbook for Interventions, we emphasize to not make recommendations on the basis of systematic reviews in general. Okay, so that's good. Nancy, do you want to go on about this? Well, okay, if not, I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in, but I guess the general answer is it's related to what Nancy said. In general, we don't make recommendations on the basis of single outcomes. So a scenario that would be appropriate is one where in your systematic review that may inform decisions, hopefully it will inform decisions pretty quickly, you would always add benefits and harms. If I understand the question correctly, so this some findings tables from a living systematic review. I believe it was actually the first summary of findings table in or one of the earliest summary of findings tables in a Cochrane review, where you see potential benefits. This is an intervention where we are reducing blood clots in patients with cancer, reduction in venous thromboembolism as a benefit, and here potential harms, anticoagulants causing bleeding. So in other words, it's not so much about the harms are extremely unlikely. You would actually know, or you should know, on the basis of your Cochrane review, whether or not harms are there. We will get back to that in just a second with another question, how you can get at this information. So whoever uses the Cochrane review would have to look at both benefits and harms. So in other words, the suggestion on the basis of a single outcome would be very unlikely. Not many scenarios many healthcare questions where you would make decisions on the basis of a single outcome. Nearly none. However, I think the second part of the question relates to, and maybe Romina, Gordon, or Nancy want to take that, relates to whether or not to make recommendations once your systematic review is used by a decision-making body, whether or not recommendations can be made on the basis of low quality or low certainty evidence.
And the answer is yes, they can. Indeed, clinicians faced with a patient do not have the option of saying, sorry, you're going to have to go home, I can't help you, there's only low quality evidence. As clinicians dealing with patients, we need, and that's the core of evidence-based medicine, to use the best or highest quality evidence available to make our decisions. So the clinician always has to make the decisions, and many of us think that guideline panels should almost invariably make recommendations, including when the evidence is low quality. Within the GRADE framework, recommendations are strong and conditional. Conditional and weak are synonyms. When the evidence is low quality, it's very likely that it's going to be a weak recommendation. You have a strong recommendation when you're clear that benefits outweigh downsides or vice versa. And when there's only low quality evidence and you're unsure of the benefits and downsides, unlikely that you can make a strong recommendation. GRADE has identified 5 situations, we call them paradigmatic, in which you might make a strong recommendation with low quality evidence, but those are unusual. So bottom line is, yes, you make recommendations with low quality evidence, but they're likely to be weak, very likely to be weak or conditional recommendations.
Excellent. So I hope this addresses the question, and we have another interesting question from the earlier submitted questions, and I'm going to put it in the chat, post it, and then ask one of my co-presenters to actually address it. If I actually am able to do that, yes, I am. So the question is, and then I'll add to that by showing a resource. So the question is, I've heard that in theory, you can downgrade half a level or a third or even a quarter, but I've never seen a review that states explicitly that this was done. Could you give some guidance of how to go about partial downgrade in terms of what to say in summary of findings footnotes? Anybody wants to take this on?
Sure,
Well,
it's Nancy.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, a lot of times we'll say, in particular when imprecision and inconsistency is quite close together, we'll say we considered imprecision along with inconsistency, and because of these reasons, and rated down for that. That's just one option of how you could word that.
Yeah, so maybe just to add to that, in terms of the process, whenever we're going through the different domains, for each domain, we have to make the decision of whether we're going to rate down or not. And sometimes we're not so sure that we should rate down or not. So in cases like this, we usually say, well, let's keep it in mind here that this was sort of borderline for risk of bias, for example. And maybe if we get to another domain in which you also have a doubt of whether you should rate down or not, instead of rating down one level for each, we can just say, okay, so I was sort of halfway in the first domain, halfway in the other domain. So I'll just rate down one level and end up with, if no other limitations, moderate certainty evidence. And the way in which we reflect that is in the explanations of the summary of finding tables. So depending on how you create them, but with Grade Pro, you sort of have to choose what domain you put it under, but that's okay. You just choose one of them and you link a footnote or an explanation to that domain, explaining why you were halfway there and how you sort of made the decision after also being halfway with the other consideration and the other domain.
Thanks so much, Romina, and I'm sharing my screen again. I bring you back to this wonderful resource that we've now shown a few times under the JCE series, the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology series on GRADE guidelines. You find some interesting resources, as we indicated earlier. These are essentially guidance and conceptual articles that describe GRADE guidelines, not referring to clinical guidelines, but to how to apply GRADE. You see that here, and there is some relevant guidance or relevant articles that particularly relate to what Romina just said, and that is how to improve GRADE evidence tables, the summary of findings tables. Part 3 is actually about the detailed guidance for explanatory footnotes, and this is just a reminder that there's some helpful information in there, really helpful, authored first authored by Nancy, and there you find some of the explanations around this, and Romina, I think, explained that wonderfully, but just a reminder that this is a resource that you can potentially go through. Okay, so I think there was something else in the chat. No, we are done with the chat. Let's just see if Chris has anything else. Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for posting that link, which people can click on and you can bookmark it, so that way you have it always handy when you are when you're working on your summary of findings table, which everybody is doing probably most of the day, every day. Okay, so there's a question that is maybe a question for Romina. Romina, it's in our spreadsheet. It's row 35. Let's just see here. So the question is around imprecision on systematic reviews. And I'm going to post it and look at it. So imprecision, continuous outcomes. There's a mistake in the calculation using the usual standard of a alpha and beta 0.05, 0.2, and an effect size of 0.2, representing a small effect requires a total sample size of approximately 400 or 200 per group. It should be 800 or 400 per group. I suspect that this is related to either it's related to one of our JCE series or the handbook. And then the second comment is much better to decide imprecision on the width of the 95% confidence interval in relation to the choice of the delta, a trial with 80% power, 95% confidence interval plus minus 7. That may be related. So, Romina, do you want to give that a shot? Did you have a chance to think about this? Otherwise, I would be happy to give it some thought.
Sure. So I think that what I would start saying is that even though the original grade guidance on imprecision, published in 2011, I believe, gave a lot of emphasis to the optimal information size, if you have been following along, or maybe not, recent guidance has built more on the importance of the 95% confidence interval. And originally, the reason for focusing on the optimal information size was related to avoiding value judgments as much as possible when doing systematic reviews. But that being said, our grade guidance keeps evolving all the time. And as you might remember from Gordon's presentation on the target of the certainty rating and the different degrees of contextualization, we have realized that there is no escaping when making value judgments. So grade guidance on imprecision for network meta-analysis, for example, that I showed you in the earlier session that will come up, starts by putting emphasis on the 95% confidence interval. And the new updated guidance for imprecision that it's on the works will also do that. So I would say first that ideally, I agree with that second question. We should focus on the 95% confidence interval and only go to the optimal information size when we have to, because it's not easy. With regards to the specific question here in the chat, this is really, really specific, and whether the calculation is correct or not would really depend on what is the actual mean we're talking about and the difference to the text. So I cannot say off the bat whether it's right or wrong. I would say every time, though, we go to the optimal information size, we do need to make another value judgment with regards to what would be an important difference to the text, so that we can calculate the size of a trial and see how that compares to the optimal information size. So maybe focusing on whether those parameters make sense can help solve this question. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add about this. And Holger, we don't see you anymore.
I wanted to give all attention to you and your beautiful video. I realized that I had kept mine on, so that was the main reason. Romina, I think we probably don't need further comment on that. I think you explained that well, unless anybody else wants to go for that. The next question is one of our favorite questions, because it can be confusing. Question relates to when to grade down for inconsistency, and the question is, please, could someone explain why we don't downgrade for inconsistency if there's only one study? I would suggest that we should be less certain in the evidence if only one study. Again, any takers? Otherwise, I'll be super happy to take this on. Okay. Doesn't seem that anybody is jumping forward with this. So the brief answer is, and again, I refer you to the guidance about useful explanations that I still have here on my screen, where some of that is explained. The simple answer is, if there is only one study, and given that we are looking at inconsistency between studies, there can logically not be inconsistency, and therefore we are not grading down. Now, is that a problem? Yes, it is a problem. That it may be a problem that there's only one study, but that body of evidence would likely receive a low certainty rating on the basis of other factors. So for instance, if you have only one study, we went through a few scenarios, it is very possible, even likely, that there will be issues with regards to imprecision. As we said earlier this morning, if there's only one study, in particular a small study, there will be issues around applicability or indirectness. So that it is very, who posted this question, it was Nicholas Henschke actually, you're certainly right. A single study leaves us with lower certainty in the estimates that we are seeing, but it may not be related to inconsistency. It typically comes from the other domains in grade. And it emphasizes what Romina said, and it emphasizes what was mentioned in one of the questions, that when we look at the certainty of evidence, we look across domains, and we should never go back, and we should never forget to go back and do the sniff test, whether or not our rating actually is consistent with what we are seeing and what our gut feeling about this evidence is. So for instance, again, that if there is only one study, there will likely be other reasons for rating down the certainty, but it would not be for inconsistency.
Only small thing to add, Grade did struggle with this at the beginning, and it's a difficult question, but for sure, I don't think you would want to say that you always rate down. For instance, nowadays you do have 10,000 patient studies from 200 centers worldwide that deal with issues of wide generalizability and end up with precise estimates. And certainly they could provide high quality evidence. So always rating down when you have a single study is probably not appropriate. And as Holger says, when the condition that I just described is not met, you may well find another reason for rating down.
Yeah, absolutely. So a single study can provide high certainty evidence, and in particular when it's mega studies in multiple centers where applicability is not a problem, and so on. And under those circumstances, that's probably justified. Okay, there is another question that we, oh, no questions in the chat. I thought there was another one. We are...
Holger,
yes?
may I actually take a minute to answer one of the pre-sent questions, because I noticed the person who sent it is here.
Just tell me which row it is, and I'll post it in the chat.
It's in row 19, sent by Stavros. And Stavros basically asked us about the difference between the grade approach for network meta-analysis and CINeMA. And I would really like to take a minute to clarify this. So basically, CINeMA is a software that was launched by a group who is very prominent in Cochrane and in the development of network meta-analysis, but they are not part of the grade working group. They came up with their own methodology for assessing the quality of the evidence from network meta-analysis, which builds on the grade principles and on the grade domains, but it's not officially grade guidance. So in the software that they launch that allows you to run network meta-analysis and to make the grade assessments, they implement their own methodology for the certainty of the evidence assessment. We have taken a very close look at their approach, and we have noticed some fundamental differences when compared to the grade working group guidance, which could potentially lead to some important differences in the assessment of the certainty of the evidence. And therefore, although of course I'm biased, like I recognized in my conflicts of interest, I believe that following grade guidance is more likely to lead you to a better assessment of certainty of the evidence than when you put things in a software and you do it through a more algorithmic approach. That being said, and following with the question of whether it might be better to use in some situations, I would say if your choice is between not doing certainty of evidence assessments versus doing them with CINeMA because that's the feasible way for you to do it, by all means, we would encourage you to do so.
Thanks, Romina. Great. Thanks for addressing this question. And Elise has been waiting for a really long time for her question to be addressed. I'm going to post it in the chat. And that is, as a follow-up to the presentation earlier on when to include observational studies, is there advice for harms with respect to long-term use, if, for instance, the RCTs are of shorter duration? So a couple of words about that. First of all, as we remarked a little bit earlier, what would be most helpful is to focus on the highest certainty of evidence. And if I understand the question correctly, if you had, for instance, concerns about indirectness of the outcome because of shorter follow-up than you would have liked to see for a particular outcome, and if there are other issues with regards to RCTs, then by all means, we do ask to supplement the summary of findings table, or even to replace an outcome in a summary of findings tables with data from observational studies or non-randomized studies. And that may be particularly relevant for rare harms where you still want to provide that information. So again, the brief guidance is, if you end up with very low certainty or low certainty of the evidence from randomized controlled trials, looking for observational studies may be particularly useful, in particular because it may inform you about information that you don't have from randomized trials. The other point, the second point with regards to that particular issue is that the non-randomized studies may actually inform your rating down for indirectness if you believe that either the intervention or the follow-up for the outcome was too short. If you see similar relative effects from observational studies, that may inform whether or not you should be rating down for indirectness a body of evidence from randomized controlled trials. Okay, and we have 3 minutes left. Yes, thank you, Elise. That's an amazing comment. Your amazing comment is thank you, amazing day. And I think that brings us pretty close to closure at this point. So asking my co-presenters for any final words before we hand it over back to Chris. Okay, I'm just seeing a few thank you notes. Then ending on time may also make sense. So Chris, back to you. And thanks everybody for participating from my point of view, and I'm sure my co-presenters feel the same way. It's been great.